Welcome, everybody, to another episode of In the Front Row with Mike Vaccaro. Coming up today in this episode, we talk with David Glenn. Glenn, a sports broadcaster, longtime show, The David Glenn Show, now back in podcast form. We'll hear his journey from Philadelphia. Young man, as a big-time Philadelphia sports fan, went on to become a broadcaster, also a lawyer as well. A lot of sides to this man, David Glenn, our guest in this episode of In the Front Row.
It's time to take your seat in the front row with Mike Vaccaro. Here's your host, Mike Vaccaro.
David, thanks so much for spending some time with us here today. And I know some big things happening for you, a new show or return of your show in a different format. We're certainly going to get to that and talk about that. But with our guests, we like to start at the very beginning with them and what got them to this point. And for you, you know, a sports fan, you're born in Illinois, but you grew up in Philadelphia. And I've got to think that Philadelphia and being a Philadelphia sports fan certainly is something that has to drive you in what you do now as, you know, in your broadcasting career.
Yeah, Mike, there's no doubt about it. And it's great to see you again. I've always appreciated you visiting with me in my classes at UNC Wilmington. So it's great to see you in a different kind of context where we get to have fun in a different way, I guess you'd say. But you're hitting the nail on the head. One way to put it would be, whereas I've gotten a lot of my qualities, my better qualities from my mother, one thing I've gotten from my dad, who still lives in the Philadelphia area, still roots for a lot of those teams now in his 80s, was his love of sports. Mm-hmm. So he would be my Little League baseball coach. We would go to Phillies baseball games. We didn't quite have the money to see the Eagles in football or the Flyers in hockey. Those were a little more expensive tickets. But my life revolved around sports. My dad says that I learned to read seriously as others are looking at picture books. I was picking up the Philadelphia Inquirer newspaper and reading about whether the Phillies had won their ball game the night before because I was so young that I had to go to bed before the game ended. So there was a year when I was 12 years old, Mike. And Philly, as you know, is a huge sports town. When I was 12 years old, the Phillies not only made it to the World Series, they won, and I was there with my dad in person. Wow. And I'm in my 50s now. That was one of my favorite moments in my entire life in any context. So that's a long time ago. In the same year, the Sixers made the NBA Finals and lost to the Lakers. The Eagles made the Super Bowl and lost to the Raiders. And the Flyers made the Stanley Cup Finals and I believe lost to the Islanders. So the four biggest pro teams in Philly all were knocking on the door of the ultimate prize, and one of the four won it, and I was there. So, I mean, you know how this works. My original dream was to be a left-handed starting pitcher for the Philadelphia Phillies. That one died quite a while ago. But I ultimately converted to writing and talking about sports, and it's one of the greatest blessings of my life, no doubt about it.
Yeah, being there in Philadelphia during that time certainly has an impact. It's got to have an impact on you. And you said your love for baseball, that was your sport, right? You started kind of at 5 years old. You even played Little League World Series, the early rounds there as well. What was it about baseball for you?
Gosh, I think it's the first one that I fell in love with as a fan. And then as a really young guy, I pretty much tried everything. You know, all of us had that kid in the neighborhood that was always trying to get together, the pickup basketball game, or in Philly, we even had pickup street hockey games or backyard football or all the above. And I was that kid in our neighborhood. So, I mean, we would hit tennis balls in the street. I still remember having to move the trash cans in the street in front of our house whenever a car came by, because the trash cans, you know, were the primitive goalposts, you know, outlining our hockey net. So I truly tried every sport. And I, as a viewer, I loved baseball the most. And as a viewer, I just felt like between playing it and watching it. And in baseball, of course, I think even back then there was 150 some games a year, right? Mm. So I'm pushing my bedtime with mom and dad every night and trying to watch the Phillies unless they're on the West Coast or something. And my brain just got wrapped around this sport. And I loved the subtleties as a left-handed pitcher. I watched Steve Carlton was the great left-handed pitcher for the Phillies. I studied that guy, Mike, to a point that is embarrassing to share with you, but because I feel like I know you and I trust you, I'll share with you. Steve Carlton had a facial tic. Like, it's never something you would even make fun of course. But I would mock his facial tic while pitching myself, while also, of course, trying to simulate his slider, which I never quite perfected. But I became a very accurate thrower. And as a left-handed pitcher, basically, if you can get the ball over the plate for starters, but get people out, which as a younger guy, I was the all-star type player. That eventually faded. As I told my dad, hey, Dad, when I was younger, I used to worry about one of the 9 guys in the lineup. As I get older, it's like 7 of the 9 could take me deep. This is getting a little harder. And he's like, that's part of the process. But I loved I played first base when I wasn't pitching. I had to learn, and I ultimately even helped coach my little brother, who's 7 years younger than I. So, I was before they had actual pitchers, I was the guy out there throwing to my brother and his teammates. But I studied the game from every angle. I watched as many games as I could. I loved the intellectual part of the game. Some of it is simple, but there's an awful lot of just nuances and intricacies and trying to figure out how to get somebody out. To me, somebody might love the challenge of Wordle, or the New York Times cross puzzle or whatever else. I loved the challenge of figuring out, especially the better hitters, how can I get you today? And I didn't throw 90 miles an hour. So it was painting the black, as we used to say, hitting the corners, throwing something unexpected, changing speeds. Greg Maddux did not play for the Phillies. Theoretically, I should hate Greg Maddux because he beat us so often. I admire him as much as any athlete in any sport that I've ever seen because he is essentially the Einstein of pitching. Mm-hmm. He's just physically good, mentally good, emotionally good. He is the freaking Picasso of pitching, as I see it. And he's a righty. But I tried to, emulate him in some ways later in life. But that's how it all came together. I love all the sports that we get to talk about. And I know baseball is one of the sports you get to call as a play-by-play guy. But it's never left me, even though our great state of North Carolina, it's the one sport we don't have at the top level, right? We don't have an MLB team. Maybe we will someday. But I've never lost my love, even for the Phillies. And I watch baseball as a fan to this day.
You never lost your love, but I'm sure at some point you realize, okay, I'm not going to get to professional level. I've got to think about something else. When that kind of realization came to be, what was going through your mind? What did you think you were going to do at that time?
At that time, I had decided I was halfway through college in Miami, not the University of Miami, but another school down there. And I didn't play baseball for my college, but I was still playing summer league ball and doing okay. But as you said, that it's just not going to happen. I actually pitched until I was 24, kind of in beer leagues and bar leagues and stuff like that. But that was just for fun. I basically decided, one, I was going to get a little closer to home. My family was in the Philadelphia area. I was 18, 19 years old. Miami's a long, long way from Philadelphia. And back then, travel wasn't quite as simple as it is now. And so I wanted to get closer to home. And I just said, I don't want just another degree. Just like I didn't want to teach just anywhere. I picked 3 or 4 schools, contacted those 4, UNC Wilmington being one of them. And I'm honored that they ultimately welcomed me into the fold. Similarly, I only looked at a handful of schools. Had to be closer to home, had to have a very special journalism or communications department. I picked the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. At the time, I think they were the #1 journalism school in the country. Yeah. And remember, this is around 1987, so it's pre-internet. I still had in my mind that I was going to try to be, I was a little less engaged on your side of the business. I didn't find it natural to be a play-by-play guy. Mm-hmm. I was enamored with writing, but I had not been trained as a journalist. So my attitude, I don't know why I'm wired this way. It was like, try to go to the #1 journalism school in the country. Try to convert to the student newspaper, even though you're a junior coming in really without a lot to show. I mean, they don't care that I got good grades at my previous university. So I had to kind of work my way up as the new junior, which is a little tricky. I didn't know anybody at the university, but I got onto the staff. I covered every sport you could imagine. Back then, it was still a very popular printed version of the Daily Tar Heel, which still exists, on the web today. And it was a very, very prominent student newspaper that a lot of famous people once contributed to back in the day. And I learned a lot. And those J school classes were some of the hardest classes I took in my life until I got to law school. And I was kind of glad that I threw myself into the deep end of the pool and challenged myself. I can't say I was the greatest student in some of my electives, but I took my J school classes really seriously. And then fast forward, you know how this industry can go. Just as you and I try to be helpful to the 20-year-olds in our universe, at the time, a guy named Ron Morris was the sports editor of the Durham Herald Sun. And he writes me a nice note back then, a physical note, saying he thought I was really good in the student newspaper. Would I be interested in contributing to the Durham Herald Sun? Yes, I would. A guy at Raycom Sports, still to this day associated with the ACC, named Rick Walensik. He contacted me, said he thought I was an interesting talent for a college student. So I actually remember, going to Charlotte, telling this guy, yes, I'll help you with these video projects and writing projects, but I'm so poor as a college student, like I can't even afford a hotel because that'll gobble up almost the entirety of what you're paying me. So I remember this great guy let me stay in his house. He had a wife and a kid, but I'm crashing on his guest room just to pay the bills. And little things like that. Art Chansky is a pretty well-known sports author and is a radio guy and a writer. I worked for a company called the Village Companies there in Chapel Hill that also helped me get my feet wet. So the combination of challenging myself at UNC, ultimately rising to, from the bottom guy to the sports editor of the Daily Tar Heel. And I was even the editor-in-chief of that paper for one summer. That was a huge challenge because it took me beyond sports. But yeah, there I was. I squeezed into a 2 or 3 year period being the fawn that could barely stand up on 4 legs to just kind of having fun with my fraternity brothers and, living college life. But I was burning the candle at both ends. I was either working really hard or playing really hard. And I'm glad I found a healthy balance because those 2 or 3 years ended up being the launching pad basically for the rest of my career.
Well, and during that time, as you mentioned it, you did get a law degree and you were practicing law for 17 years. How did that all play into things?
Yeah, that's a crazy story. I don't know how many people have a story like this, but basically, to be candid, I think like most people, you hope to be good and you control how hard you work. But I'll be blunt. I didn't know if I was going to make it as either a sports media member or as an attorney. So my thought process was I'm a logical guy to the point that it annoys my wife sometimes. Like she'll say it in a way that's not always a compliment, how logical I am. But my logical approach was I'm going to be an attorney. And I did a lot of wills, contracts. I actually even represented other sports media members in their when you're low enough, you don't really need a representative. But when they worked their way up and maybe ESPN wanted to hire them, they needed somebody to read their contract, maybe even negotiate some terms. So that was part of my law practice. I really enjoyed contract law, wills, trusts, and estates. But I had these parallel universes where essentially, and I was young and single at the time, so I could be a 30-hour-a-week attorney and also a 30-hour-a-week sports media guy, contributing to some of those folks that I had mentioned, working part-time, probably 5 days a week at the Durham Herald Sun and some of those projects with Raycom and those other companies. I even was a freelancer on a very occasional basis. Usually when the older guys, the more accomplished people were unavailable, certain freelance stuff like from the New York Times and the Washington Post would trickle down to the young guy. But that got on my resume at 22 years old or whatever it was. So in my 20s, that's where that dual career thing really unfolded, and into my 30s. And I'm glad I did it that way. To this moment, as we speak, I'm trying to bring a law firm into my universe or vice versa. Even as I'm ramping up this new sports media concept, I still have done enough law-related work that I enjoy it. And I'm not one of those recovering attorneys who, hated it, which some people do. I really have been blessed to have 2 careers that I love. counting UNC Wilmington teaching, there's 3 careers that I love. So I'm incredibly fortunate that way. All 3 of them allow you to connect with people in one form or another. And to me, what's more important in life than impacting other people in positive ways, or sharing things with them, or informing them, or hopefully entertaining them. So at some point, it became clear that where all my law buddies were making more money in law, I actually unexpectedly, fell into radio after training as a journalist. That was sort of an accident. But at some point, maybe 2010, it became clear. I think my wife, Maria, I call her the lovely and talented Maria, she looked at me and said, "You better take something off your plate, or you're either going to die of a heart attack at 40 or whatever years old I was at the time, or I'm going to divorce you, because you just have too many things going on." So that's when I took the deeper dive into sports. I put the law on the back burner, and we'll see if I end up bringing the law back again here down the stretch.
Saved your marriage, saved your life.
Yeah.
Well, she's more than lovely and talented. She's very smart.
Right. And you better listen. There's that look we all know in our partners. They might say 10 things, but one of the 10 has a certain glint in their eye. Like, you better listen. That was one of those 10%. And I listened.
Well, certainly a part of your success is your location and tapping into the ACC. And a lot of what you did to start with was with the ACC. Tell us a little bit about that. And again, the advantages that maybe you had being in this area.
Well, Mike, I mean, wow, this is incredible to say out loud. Every time I say it, I get goosebumps. So imagine being in your early 20s or mid 20s. And even though I grew up in that pro sports town, I did love college basketball. I actually was mad that the local stations would talk 90% pro sports when I would look forward to the March Madness tournament like you wouldn't believe. So remember, as a child, I would have seen Jim Valvano and NC State win it all in 1983. That's when I was in high school. 1985, I'm a senior in high school. Villanova, a Philadelphia-based school, wins it all in Cinderella fashion. Yeah. To this day, they're still the lowest seed ever to win the NCAA tournament. The Villanova Wildcats were an 8 seed back in 1985. So what an unbelievable story to see through the eyes of what 16-year-old or 17-year-old, whatever I was. And of course, everybody knew who Dean Smith was. And by the time I was at UNC, everybody knew who Mike Krzyzewski was. He had not yet won those 5 NCAA titles. But just imagine getting these freelance assignments from these various sports media companies, and one of them enabled me to have one-on-one annual interviews with Dean Smith. So, I mean, it's amazing to interview these people, but it is different, as you know, when you get them on your own. It's just a whole different animal. The other people getting Dean Smith one-on-one would have been, Curry Kirkpatrick or some Hall of Fame sports writer for Sports Illustrated back then, or John Feinstein or some other famous author. Because of some relationships, I would get at least one with Coach Smith. Because of some other relationships, Raycom mainly, I would get Coach K one-on-one. And because of some other relationships, I would get Jimmy V toward the end of his career one-on-one. I mean, my mind is still blown about this. So it really allowed me to dive into the ACC culture. It's so unusual, right? 3 schools that you can drive. 2 of them are 8 miles from each other. The third, NC State's not that far away. Mm-hmm. And there was that overlapping of Jimmy V, Coach K, and Dean Smith. I mean, holy cow. So that's my world in my early 20s and mid 20s. And at around the same time, as I was launching into that dual law media thing you described, we created the ACC Sports Journal. And there had been a newsletter. Its nickname was the Poop Sheet, which is a funky name that's kind of hard to describe. But my attitude, I remember this, getting this phone call. They asked me if I wanted to be the editor of what they called at the time, Poop Sheet. It was truly a newsletter that you would print on a Xerox machine, and you'd have to get one of those old-fashioned folders and mail to people that way. And like a trifold kind of thing. And there I am. I was thinking, where was this job offer before I tortured myself in 3 years of law school? Where was this when I needed it in 1991 or whatever? Instead, it comes along in 1994. And I don't know. Some people say that this suggests that I have a chip on my shoulder. I try to describe it as I'm just a very blunt, candid guy. And I know it comes across, I'm from Philly, so it comes across as obnoxious sometimes. But I would argue that 90% of the time, people appreciate bluntness and directness and honesty. So whether it's a fault or a quality that's admirable, I don't know. But I said to him, if you think I'm going to take over something called the poop sheet and leave a message for Dean Smith and Mike Krzyzewski, hey, will he call back David Glenn from the poop sheet? Like I just said, I didn't just do 3 years of law school or get a journalism degree to lead up to that. Like it's just not happening. No offense. I didn't try to play big time anybody. I just said candidly, either you're going to allow me, by that point, I was probably in my mid or later 20s. So I had some street cred by this point. And I had a law practice and I had all these freelance gigs. So I had a little leverage. I said, here's the bottom line. If you want me to take over your magazine, we're going to rename it. We're going to change it from a newsletter to an actual magazine. We're going to get it on newsstands. 1994 was like baby steps toward the internet. I was a young guy. I wasn't super technologically savvy, but I basically said to what I am now, the old guy. I said at the time to the old guys, let me be the one to help you merge into the new world, the internet world. Even though I had no special expertise, I knew more than they did as the old guys. So over the course of 94 to 98, I did all the things that they ultimately agreed to my terms, essentially. And I created the magazine under a new name and later created the website, brought them into the 21st century just in time for the 21st century to arrive. Ultimately bought that magazine website combination. I sold it years ago, but that was a wild story. And again, it is, even as I just launched another new media venture, it's funny. It is not my favorite thing to be the entrepreneur. I would rather be the writer, the editor, the TV guy, the radio guy. It's hard to explain how I end up in these positions. I really enjoy working for other people who live up to what they often say is, we hire talented people and stay out of the way. In my experience, about half the people who say they'll do that don't do that. So sometimes I end up being the boss, sometimes for very long stretches. And that was an example, even in my 20s. And I ended up signing paychecks for a long, long time with that magazine and website after I ultimately bought them.
Yeah, certainly you did well with it to improve it, get it to where it was, like you said, before you decided to sell it. A little bit during that time, the David Glenn show came around, 2009. What led to that? And again, kind of a different medium for you, obviously, at that time. But was that something that you looked at and had any hesitation starting?
I did have some hesitation. I remember being asked, well, here's how it happened. First, you have to picture the 24-hour sports radio world that we're used to now. Even though I grew up with it in Philadelphia, it was not nationwide in the 1980s. Only the biggest cities, there would be sports radio shows, maybe an hour a night or something like that. But 24-hour sports radio stations didn't really blossom until the later 80s and the 90s. I don't think our state had any 24-hour sports radio stations until WFNZ in Charlotte in the mid-90s. So, of course, once you see the proliferation of 24-hour sports radio stations, what do they need is content. Mm-hmm. And you're not going to get the famous coach, the famous athlete, the famous whoever every time for every single show if you have to fill 5 days a week or whatever. So eventually you start picking from the sports media and from other areas, folks that you enjoy, you think they're either informative or entertaining or some combination, or maybe they have a little niche. One of my niches being sports law, one of my niches being the ACC by that point. I had created the magazine and website. So I was a very frequent sports radio guest on WFNZ in Charlotte. And then eventually where I lived in the Triangle, something called 850 The Buzz came along. Mm-hmm. And I believe 850 The Buzz was the second station in our state to go 24-hour sports. So it had a sports show that I had appeared on as a guest, but then they go 24-hour and then they need more guests. So now I'm on all the time. At some point they said, have you ever thought about having your own show? And this is where I don't know if being blunt and honest is a flaw. I said, no, I've never thought of having my own show. Do you have any training in it? Not really. I fiddled around in college with TV and I fiddled with a little student radio station, but I spent literally 95% of my sports media time on the student newspaper. And that's what I had thought I was going to be, as a writer and an editor. And they said, after I gave all the wrong answers, they said, do you want to try? And I said, I'm a lawyer. I have a lot of clients who lean on me. I forget if I was a business owner yet. I don't know if I had bought the magazine and website, but I was the guy. I was the one hiring the freelancers and the photographers, and I was running the show even before I bought it all. And I was thinking to myself, I'd be crazy to leave two things that at that point I already knew I was pretty good at. I had already gotten over that self-doubt hurdle. Can I make a living in either one? I was making an okay living in both, which added up to a nice combination. And I was thinking to myself, I don't know if I'm going to be good in radio. And actually I said to them, how do you know I'm going to be any good? Because as you know, I've always thought that being interviewed is 100 times easier than hosting your own show. And that's not natural to people outside the industry. But if somebody is just throwing me if I'm the ACC expert and I'm on with a guest and he's asking me ACC questions, well, that's what I've written about and all day. Like that is the proverbial fastball down the middle of the plate for me to answer. I've always said, unless somebody has an anxiety issue, which people do, if any person is asked questions entirely in their expertise, they're probably going to do okay. It gets hard when you're outside your expertise. If you've never given a best man speech, you might be nervous the first time you do it. That's normal. And actually, you'll laugh at this, given the polished pro, and I mean that you are. The first show I ever hosted, I negotiated, how about this, guys? Give me a once-a-week show. And I truly said, you guys might not like me. And if you don't like me and I'm dumped from sports radio, I just left my law and my writing stuff behind. I can't take that chance. So I said, how about this kind of little compromise? Give me a once a week show. I'll see if I'm any good. I don't know if I'm going to be a good host. I nearly hyperventilated the first time I hosted a show. I remember a guy named Brian Maloney cracks the door at my first commercial break. And I said, how am I doing? He goes, great. And I'm like, but what? And he goes, breathe, breathe, because I had been so charged up to share all this information that's in my noggin. And it's the first time I'm hosting. Again, it's way easier to answer your great questions. So he's like, breathe. And I was like, all right. So little by little, you get better. Little by little, you gain confidence. And sure enough, I forget how many years down the road it was. I kept my law stuff. I kept the magazine stuff. It was helpful with the radio show. At some point, the same station had an opening. And they said, do you want to take this little, 2-hour a week, Saturday morning show? Do you want to take it 5 days a week? And how about in drive time? Well, so then I had a big decision to make. That was another conversation with the lovely and talented Maria. And we actually reordered things so that I was all three. For a while, I was the lawyer, the editor, and the radio host. Wow. And only when so the David Glenn Show might have been created in the early 2000s, but it was 2009 that we went statewide.
Okay.
So it's not coincidence that I went inactive as an attorney in 2010, because that was another one of those, the plate is too full. I started handing off some editing. I was still involved with the ACC Sports Journal and ACCsports.com, but I hired a web editor and I just reorganized things. I handed off some of my law clients, and sports radio, certainly by 2009, when we went statewide and started to be on in Wilmington and Asheville and Boone, and of course the Triangle and Charlotte for a while, the Triad, everywhere a lot of people live carried our show for at least the whole 11 or 12 years. So yes, it was an accidental falling into radio, which ended up being my number one paycheck for a long time. I had to overcome self-doubt and not knowing if I'd be any good at it. But it turned out to be the bulk of my income from the early 2000s until 2020, when the pandemic hit all of us like a brick wall.
Well, yeah, your self-doubt sounds like us with this show a little bit as well. Yeah, it sounds good, but then you got to put it all together. But, for you, obviously you're talking sports on that show, but you're doing a lot of interviews, right? And we're going to get to some of the big names that you had a chance to interview. But I want to know, in your mind, what makes for a good interviewer and maybe a good interview overall?
Yeah, to me, there's a handful of things you have to have. One is preparation. Preparation to me is kind of two parts. There's general preparation, being on time, showing yourself as a professional, making sure all the equipment works. I mean, I had one embarrassing moment, fortunately, only one over 30 some years, where I never hit the play button. I mean, that's just horrible. My body shakes when I tell that story. Fortunately, the person was very kind and understood, but that hurt. So that general preparation that you would do no matter whom you're interviewing. Then there's the specific preparation. Like, some people think we show up, see the microphone, the lights come on, and I'm not that talented. I'm not that talented to wing it. Most people are not. No. So it's the more research you do about your subject, the more intelligent your questions are going to be. And our job as interviewers is to maximize, to me, in my opinion, is to maximize what the audience gets. And so the more research you do, you might end up with 25 questions that are worth asking, and you got to whittle those down depending on how much time you have with your subject. But so general preparation and specific to that guest preparation, good old fashioned, just research and hard work. I always add with my UNCW students and others, energy. Besides preparation and research, you got to bring energy to the table. 9 times out of 10, we probably are intrigued and excited about the person that we're interviewing. But that 10th time, you got to pretend that you are. I mean, because if you don't care or I don't care, why would our listeners care if we don't just have that little juice in our voice, right? I mean, I've heard you call UNCW games. I've never heard you sound like you wish you'd rather be, on a yacht in the Caribbean, although there may have been days. Yachts in the Caribbean aren't exactly a bad gig.
I'll take that some days. I'll take that some days.
But it's taking pride in your job. It's paying attention to detail, right? You can't ask a guest about how their dad is doing if their dad passed away. Yeah. I mean, we all have to avoid those stepping in the pile moments. And that does go back to preparation / attention to detail. And then just advocating for your audience. I've always thought, you're a person with a unique look at the world, and I'm a person with my own different unique look at the world, but we're not kings, right? We're not only thinking for ourselves. It's some blend of what you are intrigued about this guest and what you perceive your audience is intrigued about this guest. Those might be somewhat similar, but I have always thought that you have to include both. I was not a monarch when I had a statewide show, right? I didn't just pound the things that I loved the most. I tried to talk a lot about the things where I felt like I had more expertise to share. Sure. There's a lot of sports where my listeners might know just as much as I do. I'm not going to bore them with some, nonsensical opinion that doesn't have any more depth than most of my listeners might have. But I'm going to jump into those topics where I do feel like I have expertise to share. I'm going to jump into those topics where we can either entertain or inform. But I always woke up thinking that combination. What am I interested and excited about talking about today? But what do I perceive the people and sports fans of North Carolina in that context? Podcasts are a little different than over-the-air stuff. All those things, and my students will probably tell me I'm leaving something out. It's just like an exam question. What makes a good interviewer? Yeah. So whatever I left out, they're going to give me like a B- for forgetting something.
Well, I'm sure you didn't leave anything out. That was very good. And, along with that, again, you became a very good, and you are a very good interviewer, and interviewing some people that are not just sports. You've interviewed a couple of presidents. I mean, I'm jealous because George W. Bush is someone we want to have on this show to talk baseball, not politics, not a politics show, but You've had a chance to talk to him. You've had a chance to interview Barack Obama as well. How does that happen? And what goes into that? Because that's got to be a little different interview than maybe some of the other folks that you get a chance to talk to.
For sure. And this will probably be common sense once you hear it, but when you're living it, it can be very complicated. The bottom line is that you need a hook to get somebody beyond the sports world. Mm-hmm. In other words, if I call Coach K or Roy Williams or John Shire and Hubert Davis nowadays, well, they know who I am. They know what I'm about. They know I'm the ACC guy. They know what my platforms have been like. And they're going to say yes most of the time because it's obvious that we have an existing relationship. And, most of these guests are, as you said, just more connect the dots, predictable guests. When you go outside of that world, you either need a personal connection. Your cousin is the personal assistant to supermodel or actress or actor so-and-so, and you just get lucky, or you need a different hook. So, for example, George W. Bush was on baseball, but that was when he was working with the Texas Rangers, and okay. Major League Baseball had an initiative at the time that they wanted to promote. So, in other words, you're not just making a cold call. You're saying, hey, baseball wants to promote this. W at that point, he was not in the White House when I talked to him. Obama was in the White House when I talked to him, which makes it even harder. But we got W on baseball because baseball had, I believe it was some kind of inner city initiative that it wanted to promote. And it asked a handful of their part owners, as I think W was at the time with the Rangers. So the Obama hook was my producer at the time, Hayes Permar, knew somebody who worked at the Obama White House. That doesn't hurt. I had interviewed former Duke athlete Reggie Love, who also worked for Obama. That didn't hurt. And then sadly, Dean Smith died. As soon as I saw, obviously famous people die all the time, but a president does not often put out a statement on White House stationery about some actor or actress or coaches or athlete's death. In this particular case, everybody knows Obama is a basketball guy. He's a Chicago guy. Michael Jordan is his guy. And everybody knows Dean Smith is the guy who cultivated Michael Jordan of Wilmington Laney High School during his time with the Tar Heels. So he puts out this statement saying nice things about the late Dean Smith as Coach Smith passed away. Well, as soon as I saw that, I put all those wheels in motion, knowing seriously that even with the Reggie Love connection, even with Hayes Permar's connection, even with an unusual statewide platform, I knew it was a 10% chance. I mean, anybody who thinks it's 50-50, the best guests you end up getting when you start the process most of the time in the back of your mind, you fill 10 pipelines and you hope one of them hits. That's the reality. Yes. I mean, it's different for, Rich Eisen or Dan Patrick or somebody with a national show. I'm proud of our syndicated regional platform, but we're a peck down for sure. But this was unusual in that it wasn't just Dean Smith. It was Dean Smith of UNC. It was my platform was the state of North Carolina. So then you add the personal connections, and I'll never forget. So we basically get the interview, but they say we can't announce it because we would look bad if the life of a president just took a weird turn, right? So they didn't say, go ahead and promote Obama. The acting president of the United States will join the David Glenn Show at 2:02. You can't do it, they said, because, if his meeting with Angela Merkel, the chancellor of Germany, runs long, or there's a world crisis, or in a national crisis, all due respect to the David Glenn Show, you're kind of low in the pecking order. So we couldn't announce it, but it ended up happening on time. And I actually had Roy Williams, of course, longtime assistant to Dean Smith, somebody who reveres Coach Smith. Coach Williams was kind enough to come on the show to talk about the death of his mentor, essentially. That was a very emotional conversation. And I remember saying to Coach Williams, who I know and love to this day, I'm never going to, I said it live on the air, I don't think I'll ever utter this sentence again, Coach, but the president of the United States is on the other line and I have to let you go. Who says that to Roy Williams? Roy's about as big a guest as anybody gets, right? Yeah. So that was, in however many years, if you count my time as a guest, I've probably been on the sports radio in North Carolina for almost 30 years.
Yeah.
Host almost 20, maybe. That is as memorable a moment. Talking about a famous coach passing, talking with a famous coach and others about him, and then having the President of the United States drop in live. When I say live, of course, by phone. It was funny. People knew the president was scheduled to join in the building. I couldn't announce it, but the people in the building knew. And it made me feel like an animal at the zoo because they were all coming like nose on the glass looking in at my studio. And I'm like, he's not here. You don't see any Secret Service running around, right? He's going to join by phone, of course. He's with Angela Merkel in D.C. Or I don't even know where he was, actually. Assumedly the White House. But yeah, Mike Tyson and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Martina Navratilova and Gary Player from the golf world, and obviously anybody associated with the state of North Carolina, I eventually got on. But even, Brooklyn Decker, the actress, and Adam Sandler, the actor, and Kevin James and Rob Schneider, we never got Bill Murray or Jimmy Buffett. Those were the two that we pursued but never got. But I would say that and I never got like Tiger Woods or anybody like that. But some people, are just next level. If they have a connection to here, we have a chance. If it's Tiger Woods and I'm just, it's just another guy, of course, that's going to be pretty tricky, even if he's playing, at the Wells Fargo tournament or something like that. But yeah, that list, man, I posted a lot of them at davidglenshow.com. I can't believe how lucky I have been and had a staff that helped make a lot of that magic happen. And the size of the platform, of course, helps. But those are some of the most memorable things I've ever done in my sports media career. And it's just one more thing to be thankful for.
One you didn't mention was author Stephen King. Was that, I know he's a big Red Sox fan. Was that the gist of that interview? Do you remember that one?
Yeah, well, we had some success just branching out. When I first got the statewide show, we tried to brand it in a way that was just bigger than when we had a triangle show. And of course, when you're asking famous people to do things, it helps when you say, hey, the triangle's a top 25 market, right? Yeah. But when you say, hey, I'm statewide I think we're the 8th most populous state in the country at this point. Again, you're not a national show, so your place in the pecking order. But with the statewide platform, we knew we were higher in the pecking order than any local show, really, unless it was maybe in New York City or somewhere like that. So we started getting more yeses. And when we got more yeses, we decided to be a little bit more aggressive. So when Brooklyn Decker, who I have a special place in my heart for because of her appearances in Adam Sandler movies, when she went to a Duke Carolina basketball game, I was like, that's our hook, right? Like, you almost feel weird asking for Brooklyn Decker to talk about sports, but I was like, she just went to Duke Carolina, one of the most famous sporting events in the whole country. That's the perfect time to get her on. Sadly, by phone, not in studio in that case. But that planted the seeds for pursuing John Grisham. He was easier because Grisham is a huge UVA fan and a huge Carolina fan and goes to a ton of games. I would see him. I mean, his seats are like center court at the Smith Center and wherever he wants to sit up in Charlottesville, right? So I eventually got him on the show. He's a really good guy and, of course, a baseball lover. And Stephen King, I didn't have quite the personal connection. John Grisham's son-in-law happened to be a huge DG show listener. So like knock on wood, there's your unexpected in. Stephen King, we knew somebody who worked with the Red Sox, his team, and just said the next time he has a book to promote, ask him if he'll come and talk baseball. And I think if you're that wealthy and you're that accomplished, Stephen King, I think, has sold, like if you listed the people who have sold the most books in the history of the world, I think he's in the top 10. It's crazy. So whatever he's got in the cash reserves is not going to be exhausted by his children or probably grandchildren. So I think if you're in that stratosphere, your assistant hands you, a list of the zillion opportunities and you catch him in a mood and somebody on the Red Sox vouches for me and he says, yeah, I'll do it. So some are just dumb luck like that, where the guys, most of his interviews, he's promoting a book or a movie, and he doesn't get to be a guest on baseball for 15 minutes. And I think when you're that famous, I think it's like, oh my gosh, this guy kind of wants to talk to me about sports. And that took 6 months probably, but we eventually got a yes. I think he joined us in the summer, so it was a perfect fit for baseball season. And it's just another, I can't believe it happened, but it did kind of story.
Yeah, I'm sure from his perspective, it's less work and more joy when you're not talking about, hey, the latest book, the latest this and that. Oh, you want to talk about my favorite team, the Red Sox? Okay, yeah, let's do it. So that's a good hook to go with that. So obviously, ultra successful show, the David Glenn Show. But then, as you said, the pandemic hits and things change. But now you're back with a show. You're back in a different form, the podcast type of form as well. How did this all come together? And, and were you hesitant about that at all? Again, going from what it was on radio to this form now and this platform.
Yeah, I have all kinds of hesitancy. Even as I sit here talking to you right now, I'll be perfectly candid about this one as well. It's kind of the only form I know. I'll put it this way. The modern sports media world has gotten so complicated that I have a lot of anxiety about this wonderful new enterprise. Even as I'm excited about it, even as I hope people will subscribe to our YouTube channel at the North Carolina Sports Network, and with the new look version of the David Glenn Show, I know that I can control the content that we create, and I know it's going to be the same kind of high caliber that we've done for a long time. But I had maybe, 15 to 20 different inquiries in 2021 and 2022. I lived a dream by getting a buyout in 2020. I used to joke on the air, it's coaches' buyouts. Wait a minute, you get paid to not coach? How cool is that? So I finally got one. I finally lived that dream in 2020. But in 2020, and I loved the time off. Plus, it was the worst of the pandemic. So besides playing golf, that was one safe thing to do. And my producer and I, Darren Vaught, must have played 50 times in 50 weeks. 2021 and 22, there were more than a dozen, I remember, inquiries. And my bottom line was I didn't want to leave the state of North Carolina. I know people think I'm being corny when I say this, but I'm at a stage of life where I'm close enough to the finish line that you can't say money doesn't matter at all. But you can say, and I say candidly, that money matters less. I needed to make more money when I was, the father of 2 young children and saving for college tuitions and all that stuff. And my wife at one point left corporate America, and there was more pressure on me to have a higher salary, et cetera, or during my business ownership. That was very stressful, but it could also be very rewarding. I'm at the stage of life in my mid-50s where I'm really, really picky. So, for example, when I was asked if I wanted to do local sports radio again, some of those were outside of North Carolina, which is an absolute no. My wife and I have been in the same house for 24 years. I was asked if I wanted to be a full-time professor by out-of-state universities. Flat no. I actually interviewed for one and bailed at the last minute because the lovely and talented Maria basically said, good luck. I'll see you on weekends occasionally. She doesn't want to leave North Carolina either. So that was kind of just not a possibility. And then I respect the podcast world, but I'm at a stage of my life where I can't do it just for fun. In other words, whereas money is it's never the most important thing, but I had to put more weight on it as a younger guy, less weight on it now, but not zero weight on it. Yeah. And a lot of podcasts are either cross-promotional in nature, where somebody's doing it either just as a labor of love, which is cool. I don't judge anybody else's approach to any of these things, or as a cross-promotional thing. But a lot of folks don't realize the amount of work that goes into a podcast does not always justify whatever economic output there is. And I'm just not at the phase of my life where I can take these folks up on the podcast idea on the premise that maybe we'll build it into something over a period of years. I just couldn't do that. So that eliminated probably a dozen different podcast ideas. And what I would say to everybody is, bring me an economic model that makes sense. Just bring me an economic model where we know we're going to take a big, healthy, professional whack at the piñata over the next 12 months. And, I've accomplished enough in my career that I certainly didn't want to be an entrepreneur again, candidly. I'm comfortable with what my resume and body of work are. I didn't need this, but a guy named Mike Waddell, a former Division I athletic director, built the economic
as well on this show.
Yes, great guy. I had to like the people that I wanted to work, who were asking me to work with them. I had to share their values in some ways. Occasionally, in the last 35 years, I have bumped heads with somebody over a social issue or a political issue or something beyond the sports world. Not often, but I'm just at the phase of life where I'm not working for or with anybody who I don't share their values and that I don't respect and admire and have fun with, right? So he got us, the North Carolina Pork Council is kind of our founding partner, and that created a budget that allowed us to approach others. And sure enough, a half a dozen folks, including some in your backyard in Wilmington, decided to become financial sponsors of the show on scales large and small. And that made it a more viable economic model. And that way, you're not asking everybody to do everything for free. At the beginning of any enterprise, most people understand you're not going to get paid. And I'm certainly not getting paid what I used to get paid, not even a fraction of what I used to get paid. Some people involved in this enterprise are taking zero salary at all. That's just the nature of a startup. Whereas I was sky high jacked up in the 1990s to create the ACC Sports Journal because I knew what the periodical world looked like. I knew we were doing things that the newspapers were not doing. I had 100% or close to it confidence that magazine was going to grow in huge ways and that website was going to hit and get subscribers in the tens of thousands. And all that came true. I don't have the media world, as you know, is way more complicated now, right? The audio world alone has young people, Bluetoothing their iPhone playlist into the dashboard of their car. And instead of satellite radio going bankrupt, which it almost did 14 years ago, it has tens of millions of subscribers. And, oh, by the way, whereas podcasts absolutely are a successful genre, there are a lot of them, right? So it's a saturated market to a degree. So my requests to everybody were, one, you have to build an economic model. I don't mean some monster. This is small scale compared to other things I've done over the years. But it has to be functional for the first year especially. So we did that. It also has to be 21st century. I didn't want it, the decline. I have nothing against AM, FM sports radio. I value those who are on it. I cheer for friends who have their own shows. But it has been a declining model for 10 years. So I didn't want to only be on terrestrial radio the way I had some offers to be. So it had to be a 21st century blend of my original love, writing, which we'll do at ncsportsnetwork.com, the podcast, rebooted David Glenn show, if you will, but also the YouTube channel. And if you have a YouTube channel and you have a podcast, so that's video, that's audio, that's writing. Now, the website just launched literally, I think, yesterday as you and I speak. That's how new ncsportsnetwork.com is. So they have the digital element. You have the advertising element. We have, we're selling sweatshirts and T-shirts. So you have, that's not, what's the better word? It's not concessions. What do you call those?
Merchandise.
Thank you. Merch. You have the merch element. Thank you, Mike. We have, I'm not allowed to call it the Big Tailgate Tour because that's what it used to be called. So there's some, legal barriers there. So we're calling it the Old North State Tailgate and Traveling Sports Circus, where we're going to visit cities all over North Carolina. It's a mouthful, I know. So there's that face-to-face element that we had for 7 or 8 years with my syndicated show. So when Mike Waddell put together this part video, part audio, part on demand, part articles, part, website, healthy number of sponsors, great guests had told us. I already have commitments from all sorts of people who are willing to be our guests. When after the other 20 proposals didn't really get me all that interested, Mike and I have been working on this one really for the entirety of 2023.
Hmm.
And if you had asked me before I left for Italy in June, are you 100% sure you're going to do this, Dave? I would have said no. I'm not 100% sure. But when I got back, some more pieces fell into place, and now here we are. We're off and running. We're going to give it a good faith effort for the next 12 months and beyond. And it could explode, given the watering down of a lot of other media. There are cutbacks and layoffs and shrinking budgets everywhere you look.
Yeah.
So there's a void there for what I would call high quality sports content and entertainment. There's a void because of some lesser competition in some areas, but it's hard. It's just hard. But I'm at peace with that. Wherever it goes, it goes.
Yeah.
And I'm at a stage of life where I can live with, whatever the result might be.
So Thursdays, 9 a.m. is when you're planning to release each of these new shows. So right now, once a week, is it always going to have a guest, some content, you talking sports, but then always an interview with a guest? Is that your game plan?
That's the plan for the podcast. I'm going to try to keep as high profile as possible guests in rotation. I already have commitments from a bunch of my people who have been on the other versions of the show.
Yeah.
The part my content. And then Mike, when I've always viewed, just as the traditional calendar starts in January, obviously, I've always viewed the sports calendar, and you're a college sports guy, so you can probably appreciate this. I don't know how your life goes month to month, but August matters, right? Like June and July, it's not like we don't stop. It's not like we stop working, but I always thought of mid to late August as sort of the January of the sports world, if you will. The NFL is back. College football is back. NBA is not too far away. College hoops is not too far away. NHL is not too far away. And then all the other things we love on top of that. So once we get closer to the end of August, there'll be 2 podcasts a week. And that might be a little different blend. But we're also going to have shorts so that if I want to do a 15-minute YouTube channel monologue on whatever topic of the day that I think I can add either expertise or entertain or inform in some way, those will drop on the YouTube channel. So basically video, audio, and sometimes the written form as well. So you know what? It's fluid. All of us ask for feedback. For most of my career, I could only place so much weight on listener and reader feedback. To be candid, once you have a monster built, it's just harder to pivot, right? You can tweak, but it's hard to pivot. This is such a blank canvas, Mike, with the North Carolina Sports Network. Somebody could write me an email when we say goodbye to each other, and I might say, that's a heck of an idea. And I'll call Mike and I'll say, hey, do you want to try that in September? Or maybe we get a new sponsor and they have an idea for what would engage them with us or would help them get their return on investment. We have the flexibility with a blank canvas rather than the unwieldy monster. We have with a blank canvas, I can say, that's what you think will help your company. Sounds good. Let's do it. It'll be we'll call it this, sponsored by that, and we will run and see if it works. And who knows, right? Some people are taking a leap of faith, and I take it personally, meaning in the good way. I take it personally. People are taking a leap of faith. You know how this industry works. I can't show them website numbers. The website literally just launched. There are no numbers other than whoever's visited in the last 24 hours. I can show numbers of other things I've done in my life, but there are a lot of leaps of faith that we're asking people to take. And it's just rewarding on a human level that so many people have had faith in us to be a part of our first year. And they've had an open mind, and none of us is sure exactly where this will end up if we're talking a year from now. But we're going to have a heck of a lot of fun, and we're going to work our tails off trying to make it work.
And that's what it's all about. Again, this platform, any platform that you do, make it fun, and certainly people will watch it. People will get involved. We saw the website. What about you? Are you on social media? How can people follow you? I'm sure you'll be posting about upcoming episodes, upcoming guests as well.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's my main handle is David Glenn Show on Twitter. So we're fiddling with threads and some other new things. I know this one's a little harder to remember, but our branding on social media is the NC Sports Net. THENC Sportsnet. So that's where we are on Twitter, also Instagram. That would also be one way to find us on our YouTube channel. And then the website is just slightly different. It's ncsportsnetwork.com on the website. So the fuller name, look at that with the graphics in the front row. Love it. Yeah, it's a little bit unwieldy there, but the starting point, just because I've had this handle at David Glenn Show, 2 N's in Glenn, at David Glenn Show. I've had that handle for more than a decade. So we have probably 16, 17,000 followers there. And that's one way that people have been able to kind of keep up to date with all the twists and turns of what we're doing.
Well, that's a lot of folks I know that are happy to see you back and doing what you love to do. And again, bringing great guests, great insight to sports, especially sports in ACC country as well. David, I can't thank you enough for spending a little time with us, sharing your story, again, going a deep dive behind it. And, that 5-year-old, 12-year-old lefty, you didn't quite make it in Major League Baseball, but you've done all right for yourself.
Hey, thanks, man. Mike, I have tremendous respect for you. It's been a lot of fun getting to know you a little bit personally during my time at UNCW. You're a lot of fun for my students. I can't teach every semester there anymore, but I hope to continue that relationship. I respect you as a professional. I admire you as a play-by-play guy. And I'm glad you're working with JR. That's one more thing we have in common. So thanks for the invitation. And of course, you're a true pro. So this was a fun interview, and I appreciate you.
Well, I appreciate that. Yeah, we appreciate JR Equipment. He's behind the scenes, but he's the one who's making all this happen for us as well. But DG, appreciate your time. Best of luck with the show. We'll certainly be watching.
Right back at you, my friend. Thanks, Mike.
Well, our thanks to David Glenn and the North Carolina Sports Network for helping arrange that sit down with David. And as always, we invite you to like and to subscribe to our show, which is a CLNS Media Network podcast. Check out clnsmedianetwork.com for more great shows. We'll see you next time for another great edition of In the Front Row with Mike Vaccaro. Have a great day, everybody.